This video is brought to you by PrizePicks. So ESPN did another round of what feels like annual massive layoffs. And I think one of the things that's important, especially people reacting to this in the sports media space, one of the pieces of context that's important to understand is that layoffs have been happening frequently along sports media. I know more than a handful of people who I've worked with within the last year who have been laid off by a major corporation. It's been rampant in the sports content, sports talk, whatever you want to call it, industry. So ESPN doing this and the callousness that they did it with, where they fired basically Ryan Clark on air. You know what I mean? Like, that's wild, right? Like, even I didn't really think highly of ESPN, but I always thought they would be more professional to do something like that. That's awful, right? It's embarrassing. And then it turns into a viral moment, and it at the expense of the dude getting fired, right? Now all the people who don't like Ryan Clark are using that to it's awful. But ESPN did another round of layoffs. And this round was interesting, right? Because you had ESPN gets rid of some of their hot take hosts every year around this time, right? You know, they got rid of like Cam Newton, Ryan Clark, and like ultimately those two guys are going to be fine. Cam Newton is Cam Newton. Cam Newton also has his own show. And he's not really in need for money. So he's fine. Ryan Clark, lucrative NFL career, but also part of the Pivot podcast, still has a healthy media career ahead of him. He'll be back in a major conversation or a major way sooner than later, right? Like, this is not going to be a derailing of Ryan Clark's media career. There are some other people where I'm like, wow, that's interesting. Those people have been there for ESPN for like decades, or NFL Network forever. Like, they got rid of Charles Davis and Tom Pelissero. I was like, wow, that's wild. Like, those are the names you think of when you think of NFL Network related coverage of the NFL. But one side effect of this whole thing has been the reaction, the conversations that people have had. And, you know, there are some people who have focused their anger at ESPN as a corporate entity, which I think is probably the right place for this to go. But there are other people who have decided to focus this anger on ESPN personalities that weren't fired that they don't like, right? Mainly Pat McAfee, Stephen A. Smith. Those are the two guys right now. If you close your eyes and you think of ESPN, you imagine Stephen A. Smith and Pat McAfee. And look, I am no stranger to taking a dunk on Stephen A. Smith or taking a dunk on Pat McAfee, right? I think both of them to be overexposed. As far as overpaid goes, I don't really try to dip my toes in the overpaid conversation. As somebody who works in this industry, you just make what you can make. You know what I mean? Like, trying to focus on other people's bags when you work in this industry and pocket watching in that way, it's just going to lead to you being unhappy with what you got. So I try to focus to be happy with what I have, because what I have is wonderful. What I have is a blessing. What I have, I am grateful for. And I can't appreciate that if I'm sitting here always talking about how much money Pat McAfee making, right? Or how much money Stephen A. Smith is making. So I choose to not really indulge in those conversations, because ultimately I think that indulging in those conversations only makes my outlook on life more negative. And why would I want to enjoy life less? You know what I mean? Hope that makes sense to some of y'all. If it does, hope it clicks. If it doesn't, hope I made something click here that works out in the future, because life is about being happiest with what you could be happy with. But anyways, life lesson aside, a lot of people focus their anger on Pat McAfee and Stephen A. Smith. And I think this is for a number of reasons, right? One, those two kind of represent the current corporate direction that ESPN is going on. Because if you notice, right, Stephen A. Smith Yeah, he still does First Take. That's a bread and butter flagship show for ESPN. But I don't know if you've noticed, they've been integrating Stephen A. Smith with their live programming more and more. The same has been explicitly true with Pat McAfee's show, right? They have explicitly tied in Pat McAfee to their live programming. Now, that might be something you ask, hey, why are they doing this? Why do they want Pat McAfee on everything? Why do they want Stephen A? I can't even watch the game without getting a Stephen A. or Pat McAfee show take about the game. What is this? It's for a reason. And it's kind of highlighting the pivot that ESPN has been doing over the last 25 years. And it's happened so frequently and for so long that we don't even notice it anymore. Like, the NFL owns 10% of ESPN. That is wild to me that it's not a bigger deal. Right. And if you try to make a big deal out of it, people will just start to tell you that, you know, they will just regurgitate the fact that they already know it's corrupted, or there's already a level of corruption there with ESPN. So it shouldn't be noteworthy that there is just transparent corruption there with the structure of ESPN. Because when you think of it, ESPN is supposed to be on some level a sports news journalism agency, right? Like, it's not entirely that, but there is a strong element of the ESPN brand still, even to this day, that's associated with journalism. And for ESPN, well, for the NFL to own 10% of a entity that is supposed to hold them accountable, on its face, is ridiculous. Like, in any other realm, we can realize how kind of messed up that is. But with sports, since ESPN has been broadcasting NFL games for over 30 years, we just don't notice it anymore. We just process it as normal. Of course, ESPN also runs the college football playoff, but covers the college football playoff. Of course, there's nothing wrong with that, right? Like, we have just been so used to how this works, how tied ESPN as a news agency has gotten to the companies that it's supposed to hold accountable. I don't even know if we've gotten used to it as much as we just given up, right? Because the energy just feels very much like people have given up on the idea of there being any serious areas of sports journalism when it comes to, like, holding leagues to account, right? Like, Pablo Torre just won the Pulitzer Prize for an article that exposed how the Clippers and Steve Ballmer were basically paying Kawhi Leonard under the table. It's a big deal. It's circumvention of the salary cap at the highest level. Pablo Torre breaks that story, wins the Pulitzer Prize for that story. Nothing has happened in the NBA about that story. They have just now started to hold up Kawhi Leonard, I think, the trade for him back to Toronto because of this story. But, like, a story like that breaks 20, 30 years ago, it stops everything. Like, you guys remember, if you're older, when the Balco scandal started in baseball. I mean, this was nonstop coverage on every major network, news organizations, and ESPN. I mean, like, they would have this, like, ESPN's version of 60 Minutes. What was it called? Outside the Lines. Yeah, they would have Outside the Lines reporting on it, E60 reporting on it. Like, there was, like, real investigative journalism going on not that long ago about these scandals about Major League Baseball, which ESPN was still a partner with. So, and I think that's interesting because people now use the fact that ESPN had already been broadcasting NFL games to kind of shield them for criticism for being owned by the NFL partially. They already, the argument usually goes they already were incentivized to not really have a backbone with the NFL. This just codifies it. It's not that big of a deal. But that assumes that ESPN never had any teeth towards anything that would affect one of their broadcast partners. And that's just not the case. Deflategate, ESPN covered that relentlessly while still being broadcast partners with the NFL. All the Tom Brady scandals, all the Michigan scandals or whatever it was, right? The Penn State stuff, right? They used to cover these things and have somewhat of a journalistic integrity. But there was a time in my life where ESPN would break groundbreaking, status quo shaking stories for some of the leagues that they also were broadcast partners with. Now ESPN is not going to break any news other than a free agent signing with the team. Like, that's been a dramatic shift over the last 20 years with ESPN. It hasn't always been this way with ESPN. I think people try to convince you that it's always been this way so that you could be more okay with how shit it's gotten, but it wasn't always this way. Which brings me back to these layoffs, right? These layoffs kind of lay bare ESPN's strategy. They are not interested in sports coverage anymore. They are not interested in sports journalism anymore. They do not feel like those are commercially viable and efficient enough ways to gain attention that they could turn into advertiser dollars anymore. What they are interested in becoming is a broadcaster and only being a broadcaster. They don't want to be associated with sports journalism. They actively avoid it. They want to be they want you to think of ESPN the same way you think of channel whatever Fox or channel whatever NBC or channel whatever ABC as just a neutral broadcaster. They don't want you to think of it as an actual news network, which it was originally founded upon. There's also another element here of corporate consolidation, right? People losing their jobs at two different networks because these two networks are merging. And that's going to be something that unfortunately seemingly will continue going forward, right? So there's that whole element of it. Like, people aren't talking about the fact that NFL Network and ESPN are merging, and that's probably why we're getting these layoffs. People aren't talking about the fact that the NFL does own a 10% equity stake in a company that is supposed to hold them accountable if there's some kind of major scandal. I mean, like, we live in the age of the internet. There could be a scandal any minute, but they own the biggest megaphone for it. Again, like, I go back to the Balco scandal when I was a kid watching Major League Baseball, and it was unavoidable, the conversation about the Balco scandal on all of ESPN shows. You would see it on Around the Horn. You would see it on PTI. You would see it on Outside the Lines. You would see it on every show. It would be discussed, and it would be a story that ESPN would not just let slide under the rug. But now I think if something like that happened, especially to the NFL, I do think we would just kind of not hear about it on some of those major platforms, which is concerning because there's a reason the Balco scandal was a big deal, right? It affected the integrity of Major League Baseball, and it needed to be dealt with. And I think without that public pressure, nothing really gets done. But now that the NFL has ownership in the loudest megaphone to hold it accountable, you know what I mean? Like, they can kind of get away with murder. It's kind of concerning. And what I think is even more interesting is that they found a way to lay off people. And instead of pointing our eyes to that, the bigger problem there, they have us arguing about Pat McAfee and Stephen A. Smith again. It's another win for ESPN, unfortunately. Because as long as they're arguing about Pat McAfee making too much money or Stephen A. Smith making too much money, they're not talking about what's going on at the heart of ESPN and what's truly corrupt about what's going on with them from a corporate standpoint. Think about it like this. I brought up the Pablo Torre thing and how the NBA hasn't really had any pressure to be held accountable. That's ridiculous. There was a time in my life where that story would have broken and the NBA would have had to do something immediately. I remember stories like that breaking about the NBA and David Stern feeling the pressure because of the relentless coverage to do something about it immediately. Malice at the Palace. They did something about it immediately, right? But Steve Ballmer paying Kawhi Leonard under the table, nothing happens. No pressure. You haven't even heard about that story unless you're like really popped into like Meadowlark and Lemon's sports media network or you're a Pablo Torre fan, right? Like think about that. Like the amount of giant stories that just don't get picked up by major networks these days. Didn't used to be like that. Really didn't. But that's what they're getting away with. And they're getting away with it not just because we're arguing about Pat McAfee or Stephen A. Smith, but also because we as a people, I think, have grown so cynical about companies like ESPN that we genuinely do not believe they are capable of more. So we don't even ask them to do more. But it's important to remember that they used to do more and they should do more. That's just my 2 cents. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below. You have a great day. Have a better night. Peace. Before I get into that, I got to thank my sponsor, PrizePicks. PrizePicks is America's #1 sports app. The app is really easy to use for player picks. Just pick more or less for a few player stats and lock in your lineup. That's it. Rather just pick teams. Well, PrizePicks has that now too. Just pick the winner, spread, or total in any game or fight. PrizePicks is available in most states, including California, Texas, and Florida. Plus, you can even follow me on the app at Quinn_C and tell my picks with one click and follow your friends too. Speaking of my picks, here they are. Myles Garrett over 15.75 sacks. 16's been his baseline the last few years. I'd be very surprised if he goes to LA and that number drops, given that he's going to see more passing attempts, given that LA's offense is better than what the Browns have been. Quinshon Judkins, 924 yards. They had 2 really good picks for Quinshon here, 6 touchdowns or 924 yards. I feel comfortable taking more on both, but 1,000 yards feels like a safer bet for Quinshon. I think he's going to have a big year this year. Carson Schlesinger, 2.25 sacks. I'm saying more. Remember, Mike Rutenberg likes to blitz his linebackers a lot more than the previous defensive coordinator the Cleveland Browns had. Also, Carson Schlesinger is probably going to have to get involved as a sack producer to make up for the hole that they're going to have to make up for Myles Garrett. And then Shedeur Sanders starting more than 7.5 games. I think he'll be the starter, play about 8 games or more this year, but that's my picks for this season. Best of all, play your first $5 and get $150 in lineups if you win. Just use the promo code HMA when you sign up. Again, that's your first $5 and get $150 in lineups if you win when you use the promo code HMA. PrizePicks has switched up their offer. There's no better time to join, lock in, and win that first lineup.